So, starting with Lincoln's integrity and character, we look at his moral courage that he has. So, Lincoln demonstrated integrity in the Emancipation Proclamation by taking a bold moral stand against slavery, even when it risked political backlash and deepened division in the nation itself. Secondly, we look at his commitment to freedom here. So, in the Emancipation Proclamation, again, he reflected his core belief that all people deserve liberty, aligning his leadership with the nation's founding principles of freedom that were stated when the nation was first created. Thirdly, we look at his equality as a guiding value. So, by declaring enslaved people in Confederate states free, Lincoln took a decisive step toward racial equality. This shows that he valued human rights over political convenience, being on a more personal level. Fourth, with his integrity and leadership that he was holding during his time as president, he followed through on his moral convictions despite personal and political pressure that might be coming from his cabinet or for others. This helps prove his honesty and consistency between words and actions. Fifth, we have his humanitarian vision. So, the proclamation marked a shift from preserving the Union to the fighting for justice, showing that Lincoln's leadership was guided by compassion and empathy. And lastly, we have the legacy of his ethical leadership. So Lincoln's decision established a moral precedent for future leaders today. This helps shows that integrity means doing what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. And this is something that we hold to today because that is very hard to keep up with.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates were 7 debates between Stephen A. Douglas, a Democrat, and Abraham Lincoln, a Republican. These debates took place in 1858 during the senatorial campaign in Illinois. During the time of these debates, the biggest topic of concern was the expansion of slavery and whether it should be allowed into new U.S. territories. Using these debates, we can see many of Abraham Lincoln's characteristics, but more specifically, let's dive deeper into how Lincoln used his power bases. The 3 power bases the audience can see through these debates is expert power, referent power, and legitimate power. Starting with Abraham Lincoln's use of expert power, we see that he knew a great amount of knowledge about the Constitution, which went hand in hand with the moral issue of slavery that we mentioned earlier. Because Abraham made logical arguments backed with fact, it gave him credibility to his voter audience, which is why people loved him. Starting with Abraham Lincoln's use of expert power, we see that he knew a great amount of knowledge about the Constitution, which went hand in hand with the moral issue of slavery that we mentioned earlier. Because Abraham made logical arguments backed with fact, it gave him credibility to his voter audience, which is why people loved him. Moving on to referent power, the biggest giveaway that we have that shows that Lincoln used his power base is by his nickname Honest Abe. In one of these debates, Abraham Lincoln said one of the most famous quotes we know today, which is, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." In this quote, the audience was able to see where Lincoln's morals lied, which gained him the connection and trust of the voters. Lastly, let's dive into Lincoln's use of legitimate power. At this point in time, Lincoln was not very well known since he did not hold an office position. However, since he was the Republican nominee, he by default had the attention of many voters and used the stage he was given to build himself a reputation of becoming a trusted leader.
During his time as president during the Civil War, Lincoln demonstrated lots of intelligence. In this picture, we see Lincoln as the commander-in-chief of the Union, surrounded by his military advisors. As commander-in-chief, Lincoln had to make quick, smart decisions under a lot of stress while the country was divided up and people were dying. This is an example of practical intelligence because Lincoln managed to stay calm and think strategically while leading the military and protecting the Union. During the war, Lincoln showed great emotional intelligence because he was able to put himself in other people's shoes. For example, in this picture, Lincoln is visiting a soldier who was hurt during the war. This shows emotional intelligence because it supports the fact that Lincoln cared about the well-being of his soldiers and families and not just about the outcome of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation is a great example of Lincoln's creative intelligence. Because of this, he was able to free the slaves that were in the rebellious states. Lincoln was creative when making this because he knew that if he freed those slaves, then they could become soldiers for the North and help strengthen the Union. In addition to this, Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation to take one more step towards ending slavery. During the Civil War, Lincoln showed great creative intelligence when he allowed people who had different political views than him be in his cabinet. Instead of choosing people who had the same political views as him, Lincoln brought in former rivals who had different ideas so that he could gain better insights and make better decisions when the country needed it most. By using this approach, Lincoln was thinking innovatively and was using creative intelligence. Lincoln was always into reading books. However, when it came time for him to be commander-in-chief of the Union military, he started reading military books to better understand the knowledge of the military. He also read these books so that he could better connect with the generals and make smarter decisions. This dedication shows how Lincoln used knowledge and his analytical intelligence successfully during the Civil War. In this picture, Lincoln is surrounded by his Union generals. During the Civil War, he had to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of generals and replace them often. Because he would evaluate and determine the best leaders, Lincoln was using his analytical intelligence. In addition to this, Lincoln would have to solve complex problems during the war, so he would have to think rationally and consider the challenges the military had faced before making decisions.